is section 4 of the 1950s notes. This is a very short section, so this will be a quick topic and a quick video. And it's stuff that we will probably refer back to, but for this section, I'm just going to kind of go over it quickly today. We'll end this chapter, and then we'll move on to the 1960s and the Civil Rights Movement. Objecting to conformity. Many social critics complained about an emphasis on conformities. You saw this in our last section. We were talking about social and cultural things, and one of the places you could see why they would complain about that would be television and sitcoms, and this kind of peer pressure, I guess you could say, to fit in and be the nuclear family and play in your gender roles and lots of different things. But there were critics of that. Criticizing advertising public taste, many post-war literature played upon the themes of alienation and American phoniness, such as Catcher in the Rye. An additional critique of American culture and society came from a small group of writers and artists called beatniks, or beats for short. There is a picture on the right side of the slide of that. They refused to conform to accepted ways of thinking, dressing, and acting, and they believed conformity stifled individualism. You will see this idea kind of evolve and expand in the 60s of this lack of conformity, and it changes from beatniks to kind of what you would call a hippie today. And it probably gets a little more outlandish than maybe the beatniks originally intended, but this disregard for conformity, I guess you could say, was something that did exist in the 50s. Those living in poverty during the 1950s were greatly overlooked due to the overall standard of living being pretty high for Americans, and new home appliances. The Other America by Michael Harrington in 1962 shocked many Americans by claiming and showing that poverty was actually widespread. 50 million Americans, that's 25%, that is 1 in 4 people, lived in poverty. It plagued minorities and whites living in rural areas the most. Cities suffered a decline and a rise in poverty rates as Americans moved to the suburbs. We talked about the expansion of the suburbs in some previous sections of this chapter. White middle-class migration hurt as they paid a large amount of taxes, and when taxes leave a city, everything suffers that are funded by taxes. One of the biggest things being schools and housing. Crime increased in the, quote, inner city. And that just is, we kind of use that term because it's not the suburb, right? The suburb is further and further away from the city, right? So the closer you get to the middle, it'll be the inner city. That's where we get that term. Federal, state, and local governments tried to reverse the downward trend by developing urban renewal projects. This sometimes backfired as it drove people from their homes to make room for new projects. The intention was good, but the follow-through on how it would actually affect people in their everyday life wasn't really there. Plight of the rural poor was just as bad, if not worse, than the urban poor. Those in rural areas were left behind as others prospered and their economic condition got worse as time passed. Corporations and large farm owners came to dominate farm production. Small farmers couldn't compete and slipped into poverty, and some farmers chose to relocate to the city on their own. On this map, or this graph on the right side, just shows you the poverty level in the United States, and that's from 1955 to 2005. And we're talking about kind of the end of the 50s, so you can see how high it was. And it was surprising because to a lot of people, and that's why Harrington's findings were so profound, because the standard of living was seemingly very high for a lot of people in the 50s, and he was just drawing attention to, well, 1 in 4 people are not experiencing that, so let's not overlook 25% of our country just because 75% isn't in that camp. Alright, this will be the last slide for this section. I told you it was a quick one, but it's stuff that we will kind of call back on in some further chapters. Quote-unquote other Americans face injustice. Latinos and Native Americans faced many of the same problems that African Americans encountered in the years after World War II. Puerto Ricans in New York City, for example, found themselves crowded together in poor neighborhoods. They did not speak English, a majority of them anyway, and had little political power, no help from city governments, and faced both informal and formal discrimination. That's something we'll talk about in our next chapter, what I just said, informal and formal discrimination, because discrimination doesn't just happen one way, and that's something I want to spend some more time on in the next chapter that we go over. The Rosero program, developed during World War II, employed many Mexicans and Mexican Americans as farm workers, but it also exploited many workers, and they couldn't complain, or their temporary visas would be gone. This was, in a way, legalized slavery, and we've talked about that before. Kind of think back to when we were talking about company towns, especially like in the mining industry before the western states were fully developed, and it was a form of wage slavery, right? This was very similar because of the standards and conditions that these guys were working in. And then the last bullet point here, Native Americans. In 1953, the termination policy comes into effect, which sought to end tribal government and relocate Native Americans to the nation's cities. This was more pressure on Native Americans to assimilate. That is something that has a lot of history behind it, and unfortunately, we don't have the time in this class to really dive into it. I believe it's something you guys talk about in Oklahoma history, and if not, if you guys have questions about it, I'd love to talk to you about it in class. But I'm not going to do it here on this very short video, but it is something that if you'd like to discuss, it is an interesting topic, especially for us being in Oklahoma. I know a lot of you have Native American ancestry. I do as well. So if you want to discuss it, we definitely can. But I'm going to end this chapter and this section of the 1950s. Our next major topic will be the Civil Rights Movement, and we will start on that next. Make sure you guys are staying up to date with your assignments, your quizzes, your notes, and watch any videos that I have posted to go along with these slides. Alright, that's it.